It was the summer of 1876. The U.S. government, determined to stamp out resistance on the frontier, sent one of its most celebrated officers, George Armstrong Custer, into Montana to deal with the Sioux. Custer, ever the confident showman, rode ahead of his men to survey the scene. But what he saw as he crested that ridge wasn't just a scattered band of warriors, it was a gathering of tribes unlike anything he'd ever imagined. Still, the man didn't blink. He tipped his hat with a grin and shouted, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." What he didn't know was that he was staring down the largest native force ever assembled on the continent, and there was no cavalry coming to back him up. Just 60 minutes later, Custer and every man under his direct command lay dead. His name, once a symbol of valor, would instead be etched into memory as the face of one of the most devastating defeats in U.S. military history. But what chain of events led to this crushing disaster? This is the astonishing tale of Custer's last stand. George Custer grew up the son of a farmer in Ohio, a boy with big dreams and a thirst for recognition. He had a sharp mind and a cocky streak, traits that both helped and hurt him when he entered West Point in 1857. No cadet before him had racked up more demerits, but even his critics had to admit the kid had something. When the Civil War broke out, Custer got his shot. He quickly made a name for himself as a fearless battlefield commander, charging into chaos when others hung back. He didn't order from the rear. He led from the saddle, sword drawn, often the first into the fight. His men admired him for it, and his daring earned him promotion after promotion. At just 23, he was made a general, one of the youngest in American history. Newspapers dubbed him the Boy General, and tales of his courage spread across the country. At Gettysburg, July 3, 1863, he and his cavalry stopped a Confederate breakthrough just when the Union line was about to give way. Dressed in full regalia, golden hair flying, Custer charged, and swung the momentum in the Union's favor. When Robert E. Lee finally surrendered, a Union general gifted the surrender table to Custer's wife, noting, "No man did more to bring this about than your husband." But after the war, glory was harder to come by. Custer was given command of the 7th Cavalry and tasked with policing the Great Plains, a post he considered beneath him. It wasn't until 1868 that he saw a new chance to build his legend. The U.S. had its eye on the Black Hills, sacred ground to the Sioux. A treaty was signed, supposedly granting the Sioux control of the region if they stayed on a reservation and left settlers alone, but Washington had no intention of keeping that promise. Gold had been found in the hills, and sooner or later, they knew the miners would provoke a fight. Most Sioux leaders signed the treaty, believing it was the only way to preserve peace. But one man stood firm, Sitting Bull. A spiritual leader and chief among the Lakota, Sitting Bull saw the writing on the wall. He understood that as long as the U.S. wanted land, they would find a way to take it. Resistance, he believed, was the only path to survival. Where Custer charged headfirst, Sitting Bull was deliberate. His name reflected his nature, a man who sat and thought before he acted. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a prophet. He claimed visions from the Great Spirit had shown him how to defeat the white soldiers. His words drew warriors from across the plains, Cheyenne, Lakota, and others, to stand beside him. One of his most trusted companions was a fierce Lakota fighter named Gall, a man who shared his cause and his fury. Together, they built a mobile force of raiders, hitting settlers, clashing with rival tribes, keeping pressure on U.S. outposts. The government needed someone bold enough to stop them. Once again, they called on George Custer. In late 1868, with winter approaching, a season when tribes were most exposed, Custer set out along the Washita River in what is now Oklahoma. By November 26, he'd found a trail. The next morning, he launched a surprise attack on a sleeping Cheyenne village. His men killed over 100, many of them women and children. Custer counted it a success. But he'd struck a village aligned with the U.S. not hostile. Peace with the Cheyenne, already shaky, became nearly impossible. Worse, this was only one village, others up and down the river were now alerted. Custer had to retreat quickly. His second-in-command, Major Joel Elliott, had chased some fleeing Cheyenne but never returned. With more enemy villages mobilizing, Custer chose not to wait. Elliott and his men were later found dead, and many in the 7th blamed Custer for leaving them behind. One officer, Captain Frederick Benteen, publicly accused him. The letter leaked to the press. Custer was livid, but the damage was done. Benteen stayed in the regiment, but the two would never trust each other again. Still, Custer's daring attack revived his reputation. To the public, he was now a Western hero. Over the next few years, he led continued campaigns against native forces. In 1873, he and the 7th were stationed at Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakota Territory, putting them squarely in the path of Sitting Bull's growing resistance. Two key figures entered the picture at this point. Major Marcus Reno, a prickly officer with a love of whiskey, joined Custer's command. Like Benteen, he found Custer arrogant and hard to stomach. But Custer had allies too, his brothers Tom and Boston, his brother-in-law Lieutenant James Calhoun, and even his wife, who moved to the fort to stay close. He also had native scouts. Among them was Bloody Knife, part Sioux, part Arikara, who became one of Custer's most trusted companions. Bloody Knife had a long, bitter history with Sitting Bull and Gall. Old grudges ran deep. Bloody Knife had once nearly killed Gall in a fight. Gall later returned the pain, killing Bloody Knife's brothers and his son in separate raids. In 1874, it was no surprise when the Army picked George Armstrong Custer to lead a mission into the Black Hills. On paper, it was about scouting out a site for a new fort to reign in Sitting Bull, but anyone paying attention knew better. The real aim was to sniff out gold and stir up interest back east. Washington needed headlines that would draw prospectors west like moths to a flame, and Custer's name guaranteed attention. That journey wasn't much of a campaign. It was more like a well-funded sightseeing trip, complete with journalists and photographers. Custer spent more time hunting game with his brothers and a scout named Bloody Knife than worrying about any Lakota resistance. And once word got out that gold had been found, the wheels started turning. Newspapers ran with the story, romanticizing Custer's adventure and practically inviting a gold rush. And a gold rush they got. By the end of 1875, roughly 15,000 settlers had poured into the Black Hills. Technically, the U.S. government didn't break the Fort Laramie Treaty, the settlers were acting on their own, at least officially. But President Grant wasn't exactly wringing his hands over it. In truth, he was watching and waiting for the Lakota to push back, giving him a reason to take the hills outright. By September, Washington made one last attempt to buy the land, but Sitting Bull had long warned his people that the Americans would never stop coming. The Sioux turned down the offer. That's when Grant dropped the pretense. He issued a hardline order: any Lakota or Cheyenne who hadn't relocated to a reservation by January 1876 would be seen as hostile. The catch? That ultimatum didn't go out until November, deep into winter. For people living out on the plains, even trying to comply meant risking death from exposure. The terms were unreasonable, and the government knew it. Come spring, the Army prepared to move. On May 17, 1876, the push began from Fort Abraham Lincoln, under the overall command of General Alfred Terry, a man who had always backed Custer. Their intel pointed to a large gathering of Lakota along the Yellowstone River, near where the Powder, Tongue, Rosebud, and Bighorn rivers converged. Terry planned a classic three-pronged maneuver. He and Custer would head west along the Yellowstone. General John Gibbon would press in from Montana, while General George Crook advanced northward out of Wyoming. The idea was simple: box the Lakota in with no way out. But Custer treated the march like a lark, slipping off for hunts and detours with his brothers. It grated on the other officers. Major Reno, for one, welcomed a chance to break away when Terry sent him scouting down the Rosebud. Reno came back with solid intel, a fresh trail pointing to Sitting Bull's camp, but instead of thanks, Custer branded him a coward for not attacking outright. There wasn't time to argue. Terry split the force again. He would head north to meet Gibbon and then come down the Bighorn. Custer would swing south across the Rosebud. If Custer ran into the enemy, he was to hold back and wait for support. But no one really expected him to do that. Gibbon himself said asking Custer to wait was like telling a starving dog to sit still with a steak in front of him. As Custer rode off, someone joked, "Custer, don't be greedy. Leave some for us." He grinned and shot back, "No. I will not." The Lakota, meanwhile, weren't blind to what was coming. Grant's ultimatum had spurred Sitting Bull into action. Thousands joined him, knowing this might be their last chance to live free on their own terms. His message traveled swiftly, rallying about 8,000 Lakota and Cheyenne to his camp. Alongside his trusted counselor Gall, Sitting Bull also found an important new ally, a young, intense warrior named Crazy Horse. He came from a different band of the Lakota and claimed to be guided by powerful visions. The name fit. On June 17, Crazy Horse was the first to strike. General Crook's troops had made camp along the Rosebud, unaware they were about to face something rare, an equal-sized Indian force willing to fight in the open. With roughly 1,500 warriors, Crazy Horse hit them fast and hard, his men darting in from every direction. His strategy was to disorient, not overwhelm. Just when the soldiers turned to face one threat, another would appear at their flank. Crook barely escaped, thanks to the help of his Crow and Shoshone scouts. 30 of his men didn't make it. It was a clear victory for the Lakota, and one that should have changed the campaign. But Crook didn't pass word up the chain. Custer and Terry had no idea. After the win, Sitting Bull moved the camp to a new location his people called the Greasy Grass, a valley along the Little Bighorn River. There, surrounded by the hills and summer warmth, they held their sacred sun dance. During the ceremony, Sitting Bull had another vision, American soldiers falling into their village like rain. He saw it as a sign. A fight was coming, and they might just win it. Custer, meanwhile, had followed Sitting Bull's trail over the Rosebud and up into the hills near the Bighorn River. He still didn't know about Crook's defeat. His scouts, Bloody Knife among them, saw signs that worried them. The tracks and trails suggested thousands, far more than Custer had counted on. They urged caution. Wait for Terry. Wait for Gibbon. But Custer had no patience for that. Just after sunrise on June 25, Custer's scouts climbed the hills east of the Little Bighorn. They saw smoke rising from Sitting Bull's camp in the distance. To Custer, that meant only one thing: this was it. The big day. Custer had 700 men, split into 12 companies. One company stayed behind to guard the pack train. The rest were heading into a fight. Custer led 5 companies north, hoping to hit the camp from above. Major Reno took 3 and moved south to attack from below, with Bloody Knife scouting ahead. Captain Benteen had the remaining 3 and circled around even farther south to strike the camp's far flank. Custer didn't care much for Reno or Benteen, but his most trusted men, his brothers Tom and Boston, and his brother-in-law Calhoun, were all riding with him. He moved carefully at first, keeping behind the ridgelines to avoid detection. At last, around 3:30 p.m. they reached the final hilltop overlooking the Lakota camp. What they saw stretched out for miles, far more than they had expected. Still, Custer scribbled a quick message: Benteen. Come on. Big village. Be quick, bring packs. Bring packs. He sent a rider off with it. But true to form, Custer didn't wait. The boy general waved his hat above his head and cheered, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." Then he charged down the hill to the south. Major Marcus Reno had just taken his 150 men across the Little Bighorn and was advancing toward the village. Alongside him rode Bloody Knife and a group of scouts, who were the first to lay eyes on the Lakota and Cheyenne defenders gathered at the edge of the sprawling encampment. Up until that moment, Sitting Bull's people had no warning they were about to be attacked. As was their custom, Sitting Bull and the respected warrior Gall were camped toward the southern end. So when Reno's men struck, their bullets hit home first in that area, cutting down warriors and non-combatants alike. Reno didn't hesitate once he met resistance. he quickly ordered a dismount and formed a skirmish line. The volley of gunfire ripped through the village. Chaos erupted as men, women, and children were struck without mercy. Sitting Bull's gut reaction was to try and protect his people. He sent his nephew and another warrior forward, hoping to reach the soldiers and negotiate a halt to the attack. But before they could get close, both were gunned down. Then, as Sitting Bull mounted his horse, an American bullet dropped it from beneath him. That was the breaking point. "They've shot my best horse," he said. "They may as well have shot me. Go, strike them." With those words, the fight changed. Gall, alongside the fearless Crazy Horse, rallied the warriors. They surged southward to confront Reno head-on. Reno, possibly emboldened by whiskey and unprepared for a counterattack of any scale, quickly found himself overwhelmed. What had started as an assault turned into a retreat. According to survivors, Reno had been drinking heavily that day. His judgment was cloudy. He and Bloody Knife tried to regroup and reconsider their options. But the tribe's new Bloody Knife, he had served the U.S. Army as a scout and stood openly with Reno. He was a familiar face, and a clear target. Reno was in the middle of speaking when a Lakota bullet found its mark. It struck Bloody Knife in the back of the head. The force of the shot sprayed blood and brain matter across Reno's face. That gruesome moment shattered whatever nerve the major had left. Panicked, he called for a retreat. "Any of you who want to live, follow me." Discipline broke down completely. The men bolted back across the river in a frenzy, tossing aside their rifles and leaving their horses as they climbed the steep, exposed banks on foot. The Indians barely needed to give chase, they simply stood and picked off the soldiers from the other side. Meanwhile, on the high ground southeast of the fight, Captain Benteen had heard the sounds of battle and returned to see what was happening. As he and his men paused on the ridge, Reno stumbled up the hill, shaken, battered, and missing half his command. "For God's sake, Benteen," he cried. "Hold your ground and help me, I've lost half my men." Benteen, stone-faced, asked just one thing: "Where is Custer?" Reno couldn't answer. Benteen scowled. The whole scene reminded him of Major Elliott's fate years earlier at the Washita. Another mess, another betrayal. Custer, once again, had charged ahead in search of personal glory. At least, that's how Benteen remembered it. Yet the echo of sustained gunfire coming from the direction Custer had gone hinted that something else was playing out. Custer had sent Benteen a written order requesting reinforcements, but Benteen didn't budge. He and Reno dug in on the ridge for the next 2 hours. As the sound of gunfire faded, one of Benteen's captains, fed up with the inaction, rode off to find out what had become of Custer's command. What he found was staggering. We don't know the exact moment when everything unraveled for Custer's men, but this is the most complete account of what likely took place. From the top of a windswept rise, what would later be called Calhoun Hill, George Custer looked out across the valley, weighing his next move. He wasn't new to this game. In past battles, he'd snatched hostages, mostly women and children, to force a tribe's surrender. That day, he likely figured he could pull off something similar: ride down hard, cross the Little Bighorn, grab the village's heart, and bring Sitting Bull to his knees by holding his people hostage. On paper, it was simple. Hit fast. Hit hard. Custer, true to form, intended to be right out front. When word of his approach reached Sitting Bull, even the old chief felt a cold shiver. He later admitted, "We thought we were whipped."
But what Custer didn't know was that Cheyenne and Lakota fighters were already dug in on the far bank of the river, weapons ready. The moment Custer's column made its move, they opened up with withering fire. That was the beginning of the end. Meanwhile, Crazy Horse and the warriors who had just finished driving off Reno's attack from the south were thundering back toward the new fight. Custer had misread the numbers, badly. His men tried to pull back uphill, looking for high ground. Lieutenant Calhoun and his detachment dug in nearby, holding a knoll that would carry his name long after he and his men were gone. Custer, along with his brothers and the rest of his command, withdrew to what would come to be called Last Stand Hill. But not everyone made it. Half of Calhoun's men were cut down before they could even regroup. Crazy Horse, leading a surge of mounted fighters, swept in from behind and swallowed the position whole. By the time they reached Custer's Hill, the writing was on the wall: Benteen wasn't coming. The hills around them swarmed with warriors. The sound of gunfire, war cries, and hoofbeats filled the air as arrows and bullets tore through what was left of the 7th Cavalry. It was mayhem. So much so that even some Lakota and Cheyenne were struck down by friendly fire in the chaos. We'll never know who stood last. But later, Sitting Bull recounted what his men told him. Up there, where the final fight happened, the long-haired one stood like a sheaf of corn, with all the ears fallen around him. Custer's last stand was not just the end of a battle. It was the end of an illusion. The shooting stopped. The dust settled. And stillness returned to the valley. Over on what is now called Reno Hill, Benteen and Reno were hunkered down, their 400 men ringed by warriors. They held their ground through the long, uncertain night of June 25. Only as the sun dipped again on the 26th, and scouts spotted columns arriving from the north, Terry and Gibbon, did Sitting Bull finally call off the fight. General Terry reached the field soon after. His first words echoed Benteen's grim question from the day before: "Where's Custer?" The answer lay scattered in the dust. 200 bodies from 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry, some stripped, many mutilated, lying where they'd fallen. A private beckoned Benteen over to one body. 2 shots had done the work, one to the chest, one to the head. "My God! It's him!" By July 6, 1876, the shock had reached Fort Abraham Lincoln. Word of Custer's defeat spread like wildfire. Just days before, on July 4, America had been celebrating 100 years of independence, raising flags, giving speeches, and looking forward to a bright future. Custer was supposed to be part of that future, a hero taming the wild frontier. His death? That wasn't in the script. America had seen itself as invincible, a shining force of progress and order. But now, 268 soldiers had been cut down by the very people they thought they were subduing. It didn't sit well. Some pointed to Custer himself. Too aggressive. Too eager for glory. And this time, it had caught up to him. Others held Benteen and Reno responsible, men who hesitated when every second counted. Few, however, gave credit where it was due, to Sitting Bull and the warriors who stood their ground, not once but twice, and proved themselves tacticians and fighters of the highest order. America had thrown its sharpest spear. And it broke on the shield of a people fighting for their home. Sitting Bull was ready for whatever they sent next.